Thank you for listening to Depictions Media Radio. Welcome back, everyone. This one's for the guys. Ladies, if you're married or you have a significant other attached to a guy, go get him. We're going to give you a few seconds to go get him while we work on this introduction, because it says this is important for relationships, and it is something that most of us men will never admit to, that we get stuck. We get stuck in emotional states that we just don't understand why we're stuck in those emotional states. And we're men. We don't ask for help. Hey, I don't need help. I'm a guy. We put on the macho front, and we decide that, hey, you know what? We don't need to deal with our feelings. We don't need to deal with our emotions. We don't need to find deeper meaning into our relationships. And it hurts us. It hurts our relationships. And ultimately, we wind up being shut out. In some cases, I know for myself, divorce happened, and I was blindsided as to what was actually going on, that my wife was, at the time, was looking for something that I wasn't giving her because I wasn't dealing with who I was as a person. I wasn't doing the things I needed to do so that I would stay in the right mature stat emotionally. Well, luckily, we have a person that can actually help us with this. And one in particular, Dr. Michael Jaquith. Michael, he's kind of fell on dear to my heart here, because how he got to being the coach that he is, and the person that helps men get unstuck the way he does. Because he followed a similar path that I did. He has a PhD in chemistry. And as you know, years ago, you would have found me in a laboratory somewhere as an analytical chemist. So, and he left the corporate world, and he's helping men find their truth. He's helping men find that emotional thing that gets them unstuck. So, in his words, he left the corporate world and now helps men everywhere discover how they can get more of what they want and live a promise and of abundant life. By combining analytical science, psychology, and the time-honored teachings of faith, Michael helps men who feel stuck, confused, and powerless to unlock those chains and find what they want. Michael is also married with 6 children, and hey, he lives in rural Idaho. That's a pretty cool place, and he himself had to find that calm and abundant life himself, and now he wants to help other men get there also. So, why don't we start with bringing Michael on the show, and he's going to tell us how the story about how he started helping men get unstuck.
Why don't we start with the story of how you decided that helping men get unstuck is the way to go?
So it's a kind of long story. Just to put in context here, I did not start life intending to end up at this spot. I thought I'd be like an engineer, scientist kind of guy. So I went off to university. I have a PhD in chemistry. I worked in corporate research for 10 years, almost 10 years. And a lot of it I loved. Like I really did enjoy that. But some stuff happened. The company I was working for wasn't necessarily going to the greatest of places. And I was given an opportunity to leave. And really there's this very strong component of the faith in me as well that I really felt God prompting me. But when I look back at what I enjoyed the most in all my time, because I did semiconductor research, I worked on some pretty cool stuff, had a pretty decent sized budget, and I got to play with all the toys. And it was the relationships with people. And specifically, there were a number of them where somebody had really changed my life by getting involved. And a number of times where I then had helped other guys just chatting in the cafe, you're done with an official one-on-one meeting. You're just kind of sitting there just talking. And he happens to mention something personal, and we talk for maybe 5 minutes. And those little snippets were what I found to be some of the most powerful moments. And so when I had the chance to leave, I talked about it with my wife, prayed about it. My wife's super entrepreneurial, I should point out. Like I'm like a mid-level entrepreneur. She's like warp 10, like to the max level entrepreneur, right?
Yeah.
And so she's like, yeah, we should make our own business. And so we both decided just to give it a go and become life coaches. And it's a little weird. I'm very analytical. And so sometimes when people talk to me, they expect me, based upon how I speak, to be analytical, logic. But as a life coach, you really have to go into feelings a lot. And so I think it's kind of an interesting combination to be able to bring this analytical mindset into a space where we have to also be human.
You bring it up because we come from similar backgrounds. I was in, we talked about this in the pre-interview, how I was in semiconductor also, and got to play with two $5 million ICP-MSs, testing down to the part quadrillion. Sorry, audience, most of you probably don't even understand what the hell I just said, but Michael gets it.
Oh yeah.
And it was fun. It was like I'm locked away in this clean room. It's like the solitude, all that sort of stuff, and there was just something else that I knew had to be there, right?
Exactly.
And, yeah,
I think it's so true. Like they give you these multi-million-dollar wafers to play with, and you like get to do all sorts of crazy stuff with them. And half the time they break them, and you're like, "Whoops, sorry about that." And it's just you need that depth. Like humans weren't meant to live in a clean room where we interact with each other through bunny suits. And certainly, it's a very important job, and I'm very glad people do it. Or else I wouldn't have my cool gadgets and technology. But I just that relationship piece was just so much more powerfully connective to my heart.
Yeah, we need that connection, don't we?
I think so. And I think you can work in a clean room and still have connection by all means. But that just wasn't the way for path for me.
Yeah. So I noticed that something about you that a lot of, let's put it this way, a lot of coaches they avoid terms like God and in religious terms, but you embrace them.
So the faith is part of who I am. Like that is the foundation upon which a lot of my identity, if not, I'd say the core part of my identity rests. And when you have a faith perspective, you either have it or you don't. And if you do, then if something works, it has to somehow mesh with God. This whole notion of religion versus science is kind of silly, actually. It's, in fact, through most of time, the bulk of scientific research was actually done by religious individuals, by priests or brothers. And so there's really no separation there at all. And I would argue and claim that a lot of the interior dialogue that is, and the, I'll say, sacrificial surrendering of what's going inside us to, whether you want to call it a higher power, to the universe, I would say to God, it's very powerful because it is consistent both with the teachings of psychology and with the teaching of theology. Those go hand in hand. And if I believe that God is real and that he did create us, it would also make sense that what psychology reveals leads me back to that. And the psychology is pretty clear. When we engage with ourselves as if there were a God, we tend to get better more quickly than if we don't. And a lot of life coaches will use words like the universe or wellness or whatever general term you want to call. And like we were talking beforehand, I think if I give the very best of intentions, I think everyone's actually trying to refer to the same thing. But I use the phrase God.
Yeah, I agree with that. We're all referring to the same thing, and well, I actually went ahead and became a pastor at one point.
Oh,
And,
cool.
And the thing of it is you talk to a lot of people who, oh, I want to be Christian. They're like, well, the Buddhists, they don't understand God. They don't understand what I believe to be God, and they're going, and they will even trail it all the way back to even to our brothers in Judaism, and it's like, but did you forget the part where Jesus Christ was Jewish? And I'm like, so, and with that being said, that I believe that the more open we are to how everybody's saying, let's fill our world with love, the more accepting we are of that, the easier it becomes for us to accept that love.
Absolutely. But I think we need to really be clear about what love means. And love is one of those words that I think the English language has slaughtered. Like, it's so hard to pin down the word love anymore. And I'll use a real concrete example. If, let's say, you have somebody who's addicted to cocaine, one of the worst things you can do for them is to give them a bunch of money. Because if they don't have money, and if they're sober in the moment, they can function a little bit. But you give them a bunch of money, and all their narcissistic friends will suddenly descend upon them. And 3 days later, that money will be gone. They'll find themselves in a gutter with some massive hangover, right? That's
Right.
not loving to just necessarily give anything. There's a lot of acts of love that aren't loving in certain contexts. And this is where I think the faith really comes in powerfully to say, yes, we all need to improve the love. And yes, God loves all of us, and we need to love each other as we love ourselves. But to clarify what that is and how does that manifest, and how do we do it in a way that is helpful? And, one of the most common ways that in my world, I see people needing to spread more love is more love to themselves. And I think a lot of times guys in particular, they think of, oh, I'll be tough love. I'll beat myself up if I didn't do the thing. Oh, I didn't do what I said to do. I'll just yell at myself inside my own head and call myself some names and that's not love either. And we have to really challenge as a society, what does it mean to love? How do we really evaluate what is in the best for someone else?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. My favorite way to actually use the word in general means that energy that passes between and connects all of us together.
Yeah. Oh, there's absolute connection. I think, if you ever doubt that there's some level of connection beyond the five senses, you should just simply do this experiment where you see somebody who's working the computer, walk up behind them and just stare at the back of their head and see if they notice you, right? Like, there is undeniably additional connections beyond the mere five senses, whether you want to call it souls and spirits, which is consistent with the faith that, as a Catholic, I believe I'm both body and soul, both, or you want to call it whatever. There are other connections out there. And I totally love can be manifest through that form of connection. Absolutely. There are times that a great experiment you should do if you have kids. It's so much fun. You want to teach your kids about the power of love and the verbal communication pathways. You go up to, so I have a 9-year-old daughter, and I did this to her once. And I said, okay, Papa, we're going to do an experiment. And I said, I'm going to say something, and I want you to react to it. And so she's smiling at me. And I look at her, and with all the love in the universe I can possibly muster in my face, I look at her and say, oh, honey, I just hate you so much right now. She bursts out laughing because the words are so incongruous with the feeling that her brain, Ted doesn't have a choice. It can't take the words. The feelings, the nonverbals overpower those words entirely. And she bursts out laughing. And I say, okay, that was just the experiment. What I wanted to show you, though, is how important what we do with our bodies is even beyond the words. And it happened. It was a moment where she had used the right words, but had the wrong body language. I was trying to, as a parent, demonstrate that. But I think it's really, really powerful that we do acknowledge it's not just words. The lawyers don't have the monopoly on how things get communicated.
I like that last statement. That was good. I totally get where you're going with that. And you said you have 6 children, right?
Yes, sir. They're a handful sometimes. But they're also, it's the best of both worlds. Like I tell people, the hardest number of children you can ever possibly have is whatever number you currently have. Because it's every time you add another child, there's some things get easier, some things get harder. But when you're in that moment, whatever number of kids you have, it's a struggle and it's an opportunity for joy and love also at the same time.
So here's something that a lot of men struggle with, and it's acceptance of who a person is, including that young person that is standing in front of us that we help create. Accepting who they are versus trying to mold them into something.
So there's a metaphysical and a physical rule that I cannot give what I do not have. Right now, if you say, Michael, can I have $20? And if I don't have $20, I can't give you $20. And in a very real way, this also works metaphysically. If I don't accept myself, I cannot give acceptance to a child. If you watch closely, you'll oftentimes see parents struggle the most to love and be present with the children that have the same weaknesses as they do. There's a good buddy of mine who I love him. He's an awesome man. He's the sort of guy that is a really tight bee, just really struggles to ruffle things, to endure conflict. And his oldest son is the same way. And I watch because it's so hard. He really struggles to accept this aspect of his oldest son because he doesn't accept it within himself. And he even has told me that he said, the amount of pain this behavioral pattern has caused me so much that I'm so mad at it in me that then it amplifies my response to the child. And so I think if you are a parent, the number one most powerful thing you can do to love your children better is to work on yourself. And this is why I actually believe in the second greatest commandment is to love your neighbor as you love yourself. As a Christian, our Lord is telling us you have to love yourself. As a psychologist, I would double down and say you have to love yourself if you want to give that love. And loving myself doesn't mean I love every action I do. Look, I've done some boneheadedly stupid things. I'm sure I'm not unique in that regard. And so I can look at those things and say, yeah, that was boneheadedly stupid. Don't do that again, dummy. But I have to also love myself and see the goodness in myself. And the more that I'm able to love myself through my own failings and accept myself, the more I'll be able to accept the child in front of me who perhaps struggles with something similar.
Right. Accept our failures and of course be grateful for our successes, right?
Oh, absolutely. Celebrate them, in fact.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Matter of fact, around here, we have huge celebrations over all of our successes, no matter how large or small they are, because they come in different sizes. But so you said some really important things where how do you teach men to do those things when a lot of times because we're both of about the same age, and where the men ahead of us told us that, oh, that's frou-frou stuff, and how do we get around that?
So I think it's pretty complicated at first, but it's also pretty simple. And so many things. It's more simple than we wish. Sorry, more simple than we think it is, but nowhere near as easy as we'd like. Let's start with some basics. If you want to be a guy who's able to love yourself, you first have to know, what does it feel like to love? And this may sound simple, but a lot of guys actually do not know how to process feelings. I mean, as a guy in our world right now, there's pretty much like two feelings you're allowed to have and be good at: anger and lust. Take a look at Indiana Jones. He exemplifies those two so well. But do you ever see him in sweet, tender moments expressing warm feelings in a non-sexual way? No, he's too busy whipping someone with his whip, or shooting some sword to a guy with his gun, whatever, right? And so we don't have that role model. We don't have that public blessing as a male to really experience these other feelings. Now we also look at generationally. We're coming in a spot where the alignment of the generations, there's some great books coming out right now about generational diversity, is such that a lot of us, your age and my age, are taught, suck it up, buttercup. Unless you're bleeding, you aren't allowed to have tears, and no feelings allowed unless it's anger. And they don't even say it's not even said out loud, but like their role model, you can have anger, you can have lust, you can't have any other feeling out there. Maybe some happiness. That's about it. Yeah. And the first thing these guys have to do is learn, what does it mean to have these feelings? there are pieces within you. If I look at the person of Michael, I would say there's a piece here that experienced this wound as a child. There's a piece over here that really loves his children. There's a piece over here that really loves his wife. There's a piece here that loves where he lives. And all these pieces of you exist, and some of them come into play more or less than others. But there's also a central unifying will. And if you're integrated in alignment, that central unifying will can drive and direct those pieces to perform in the way in your life you want them to. But if you're not, if you don't have that integration, individual pieces will take over. And this is what you see so often when we hit the famous lines of, why did I do that? That felt like that wasn't even me. What just happened there? How could I have done this thing? And it's because there's a piece that isn't cared for enough that takes over and drives us into an action that later on we don't want to have done. And so as a guy, I not only have to learn how to have feelings, I have to learn how to have soft, tender feelings for these pieces of myself that have done things in the past that I'm deeply ashamed of or deeply hurt by. And this is where we have to really start getting deeper, is we have to look at what are these pieces in there? What is their hurt? And how do I love them, even though they've caused me so much hurt in the past? Does that make sense as a way to start?
Yeah, it does. And just some self-identifying on that. And there's like certain scenes in life that they play over and over again in my head. And that feeling of, those feelings of hurt and despair rise up, and I'm like, well, wait a second, that's past, it's done, it's over with. It's like, and I start to realize that maybe I haven't completely, or there's a time for me to work on it again, right?
Well, this one of the secrets is the past isn't the past. It's not dead. It's not the past. It still lives in you now. There's still a piece of you now that if you haven't healed that piece, is still living there right now.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. That makes total sense. So how do we learn to deal with all these pieces and then learn to love all these pieces?
Lots of times you need somebody else. A lot of times you're in it too thick. Like if you're too deep in the woods and you need to see what the roadmap looks like, all you see is trees everywhere. I don't know if you've ever been in, much time in the forest. There was this horrible movie that came called The Blair Witch Project. Drove me nuts. Growing up in northern Michigan, like you learn how to move through the forest, and these boneheaded idiots are doing everything wrong. And you're like, oh my gosh. But then I realized that while I'm so quick to condemn the children in this movie make silly choices, that I did the same thing to myself emotionally. And I'd be so deep into my own emotional quagmire, my own emotional wounds, I couldn't even see what was going on. And so a lot of times you do need somebody else to step in. In the case where there's serious trauma, say sexual abuse, neglect, some really serious big ones, then you need a licensed therapist. Because what's happening in that scenario is your parts, your pieces, your nervous system are so badly damaged that it cannot process on its own. And so the therapist effectively loans his fully functional nervous system to you to help process. And this is done verbally by walking through. And he might say something like, oh, if that had happened, I would think I might feel like this. And you say, oh, that's right. That is what I'm feeling. And so that's the therapist loaning his nervous system to you. But that's, well, I'll say for the more serious case, for most of us, when we're just looking at, when I was 14 years old, this guy at the ice skating rink fell and made it look like I tripped him. And then everyone else, all my friends called me names. And so I'm still kind of grumpy that wasn't real. I didn't trip him, but there's this wound from that. And that sounds so silly that as a guy, you're like, oh, suck it up, Buttercup. Who cares? It was 14. Is the ice skating rink? I'm over that. I don't know those people anymore. They don't know me anymore. Why does it matter? But we need to understand that it does still matter. And so if you need a coach in a situation to be able to step back and say, oh, actually, it does still matter. And what a coach does is a coach doesn't process for you. A coach just simply pulls it up for you to see what you're doing. And this is true in all the sports. Like, so if you're a basketball player and you hire a basketball coach, the coach doesn't get on there and dribble the basketball for you, but he does tell you, oh, I see you're putting too much weight in your left foot when you go to shoot. Oh, your ball's slipping your hand. So he pulls it up and highlights to you, this is what I see happening. And then you as the player get to adjust. He might even have a practical advice. Maybe you should rotate the ball, rotate your hand a little bit as you're holding the ball before you shoot, whatever. I actually don't play basketball. I'm making this up as I go. Full confession, I'm not a basketball guy. And so this coach holds it up, and it's the same thing with its emotional self. And so perhaps, Michael, I'm making this up here, but maybe you were this 14-year-old who, as at the ice skating rink, someone else fell and blamed you for tripping him. As a coach, I hold up and I say, oh, I see two things happening here. Not only do I see a wound present, but I see you shaming this part of yourself in this wound. And that just even that awareness allows your nervous system to redirect and to reframe how it's happening, and tremendous healing can take place even from that.
Right. That makes sense. And hey, I was a not quite a star on in track and field, but I won my fair share of races.
All right, there you go.
Yeah. And I remember my coach, you know how you load up in the starting blocks for the sprints, right? And he'd say, no, put your foot this way. Do this, a little more of that, and a little of that, because you're doing too much of this. You're not pulling your weight enough with your legs, and you're pushing too much with your hands. So we're going to adjust things so that you're half, and they had you balance so that you perform.
Yes. One of the differences between conventional coaching and life coaching is on the starting block, the coach can see the position of your legs and your feet, can see which muscles are tensing. There's a lot of real direct evidence he has. When I'm working with a client emotionally, I get their facial expressions, but such a simplification. I can have the same facial expression for frustration as I do for, say, discrete pain. Maybe I just got bit by a mosquito as I'm talking to you, and I flinch, and that can be misread. And so much more life coaching involves this interrogation technique where I'm asking you questions. What is going on here? And then holding that back up to you again. So there's a difference there with it. But you're right. That's a great analogy with a coach.
Yeah. So you have a process about how you discover for people and how you actually start to guide them, right?
Absolutely.
So why don't we talk a little bit about those steps about how you do that for people?
So the first thing I tell people is you're not going to change if you're not committed to changing. There's a reason why you haven't changed so far, and it's because you don't actually want to. Because if you did, you do it. Like, for example, right now, I have a pen on my desk. If I want to pick up a pen, I pick up the pen. Okay, that was relatively simple. The bar is low. But if you tell me, Michael, pick up the desk, I'd be like, okay, well, I probably could build enough strength to do it, but that's going to take some suffering to get there. Now, if you say, Michael, I want you to pick up the desk and hike up the mountain over there, well, that is humanly possible, but the amount of struggle I'm going to have to do to get there is a lot, right? And so to a lot of us, these emotional work, especially as guys, feels like picking up the desk and hiking up the mountain, right? And so it's very, very intimidating. So the first thing I tell people is you're going to come in, you're going to talk to me. Are you ready for change? Because it's going to be uncomfortable. I believe it was Freud said that what you need most that we found. Oh, Jung said that what you need most will be found where you least want to look. And the reason why you need it the most is because you've never gone there to look. And so the first step is, are you willing to do this? But then we say, what is it specifically you want to change? What is the behavioral pattern that's manifesting? And then we go looking, what's underneath that behavioral pattern? And within an hour, I generally will show a guy some piece of themselves they've never been able to look at, had the courage to look at, had the clarity to look at, whatever the reason is, there's some piece of themselves there that's manifesting this behavioral pattern they don't like. And what's going on there? Now, to actually start changing that piece is different. But within just this discovery process, really, really careful questioning. What is happening here? What are you thinking? Being curious, just digging down there. It helps a lot, the analytical mindset we talked about earlier on, that I can put patterns together. It's not uncommon when I'm working with a guy for the first time. He says, I'll make one up. Oh, I really don't like that I just treat my wife so poorly. And I'll say, cool, let's talk about that. Why are you treating your wife so poorly? And he'll say, well, it'll happen right after the kids do this, or maybe my job does this. And sometimes I even tell him, I wonder, maybe, tell me if this fits. Is there a possibility that what's actually going on here is how you see yourself based on what these other things are doing, and you can't stand seeing yourself this way, and you're actually projecting from that place of shame into how you're treating your wife. And sometimes I'll be like, wow, that's so true. I never looked at it that way. And so that discovery process, it really requires a commitment to honesty, a commitment to going into that discomfort, and a commitment to sharing something that you probably are not going to enjoy about yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Because there are places where without the right guidance, you won't flip that rock over.
No. And you don't want to. You're strongly compelled not to, because maybe once as a kid you did. And as a kid, your nervous system interpreted what happened next as a dragon jumping out and eating you. And you're like, well, I'm not touching that rock again.
Right. Exactly. So once you get somebody down the road, then how do you start to, of course, a lot of coaches say, oh, well, the client determines the goals, not me. But there is like some general results that you'd like to see from people where you know that they've actually found that success.
You're so right. In all the certification programs, they say it's 100% the client's journey. You're not allowed to have any agenda for them. I mean, come on, I'm human. I want to see somebody succeed. I want to see them experience love and find happiness in their life and find the peace and freedom from whatever they're struggling. Of course, I have an agenda for them. And so what I see as I'm going through this, though, is there's this constant self-checking to hold that back. And of course, that desire is there because, truth be told, Michael, I make some really powerful relationships with some of these guys. Like when you spend time, a significant amount of time exploring deep in someone's life, and then that transformation and the joy that comes as they transform, you get to become very attached to them. And it has to be a professional relationship, obviously. And that's honestly one of the reasons why I specialize in working with men is I think that I would have a harder time holding that attachment if it was a lady. So that's just my own weakness. But my point I'm going here with, as you're going through this process, there is a really simple, powerful steps. You have to first accept this event happened. This piece of you exists. This wound is there. You have to forgive whatever in that situation needs to forgive. Sometimes that's yourself. Sometimes forgiving yourself means one of the hardest people to forgive. And then coming at that from a faith perspective, and use faith-based language for this next step. And I say you have to surrender that to God. To surrender your sense of justice. You have to surrender all that could have been, because there's a grieving process too. We as modern Americans do not mourn and grieve well. Or I should say, really, first worlders, all of us. We do not give space for mourning. We do not give space for grieving. About 2 years ago, I lost my grandfather, and I was invited to say something at the funeral, and I did. And I talked a little bit about creating intentional space to allow the feeling of grief and mourning. And that it's easy in the case of a loss of a loved one. Like we all see that. Okay, great. We're going to cry at a funeral. It's much harder to grieve things that are less tangible. And one of the most powerful things we need to grieve is the loss of opportunity, the loss of potential goodness, the loss of a plan, the loss of a relationship. And these we also need to grieve. And part of the healing process, we surrender to God, and we have to mourn that. And through that process, learn to accept that part of ourselves and even care for it. One of the more powerful images I'll oftentimes do, especially with if the guy I'm working with is a father, is I'll say, let's imagine that your son came to you and said this, and had the same situation happen. What advice or what would you say to your son? And almost without exception, the first words out of their mouth are pretty hard. Like, oh, I'd say you gotta suck it up. It's not a big deal. Get over it. Something variation of that. Say, oh, is that what he needs to hear right now? Oh, no, I guess not. What do you think he needs to hear? And say, oh, he probably needs to be affirmed and to be told that reaction is normal and that he's okay. And I say, why is it you're struggling to offer him that right now? And the answer is almost always because I can't give to myself. And we go through this process and just coming up with different ways to look at what's happening inside of these various pieces and parts of ourselves. It's not like it's magic. The only spiritual thing happening is coming from the good Lord above, right? I give him full credit for all that. But my own part is just this relentless, calm, patient pursuit of what there is good and bringing it into the right perspective.
Yeah. And that's where the whole thing lies, is perspective.
Because, perspective's everything.
Yeah. Sometimes it doesn't even have, I just turned 1 degree and it's a whole different view,
What's Henry Ford's line that if you think you can do it, you're right. And if you think you can't do it, you're also right. That perspective is key. Maybe you come home and your wife, for whatever reason, doesn't engage with you physically the way that you want her to. Perspective. Is she a horrible person who hates your guts? Well, you're going to treat her a certain way, and that result's going to propagate forward. Or is she an amazing person who gave every bit of energy you have caring for these children in this house that you love so much, and you're so grateful for all she does? Both statements could potentially be true. Probably not the first one. But the perspective that we take on that determines the results we get next.
Right. Yeah. If you want her to be loving, even more loving down the road, you know which
number 2 is the winner. Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't go for number 1. Pro tip. So that's my free coaching advice for all guys listening. Don't choose perspective number 1 in my example.
Yeah. Because trust me, it's like, yeah. If you choose the wrong one, you'll know quick. Yeah. Oh yeah.
Well, sometimes they're more subtle though. Like that one's pretty complex. So some of them actually, we can linger in incorrect perspectives for decades.
Yeah, it's true. There was something I'm not going to get into too many details because my dear wife doesn't always like me sharing too much over the show, just in case we run into somebody on the street. But there was something that I had been doing for a number of years, and she didn't like it, and she just say, "Well, it's just him. I'll just live with it," right? And we were just sitting there talking about stuff, and it just happened that the habit just happened to pop up, and she's like, "I really hate that." Oh, okay. Well, let's work on taking those steps to change it.
Yeah. Kudos to her for being willing to say something, because there's a risk there too.
Yeah, it's like, and this is something that leads into something else that I found out of a lot of guys that I discovered through another series of groups and everything that I was in, that most men don't find it difficult to find an honest relationship with another person.
They struggle to be honest with themselves. And we really struggle. I don't know if you ever listen to the narrative of your self voice in your head, but sometimes you should stop and listen. Sometimes it's rather scary. And we speak to ourselves so horrifically that if someone spoke to my children the way that I speak to myself in my own head, I would be upset with them, right? But we do this to ourselves all the time. And we delude ourselves. The psychologists tell us it's so powerful. The human being's brain's ability to self-delude is stunningly high. We can trick ourselves in believing all sorts of things. And so how could I possibly have an honest relationship with you if I don't have an honest relationship with myself? If I'm not living in integrity, I cannot give you what I do not have.
Yeah. Well, on that one with the self-talk, what I found one day, I started listening to my own self-talk, and it led straight back to my own father's self-talk.
Yes.
I used to listen to how he talked to himself, and then I found myself was like, oh my God, I sound just like my father talking to himself.
It's very, very common. Parents pass on so much more than DNA, and both the good, the bad, and the ugly. But again, going back to what I said earlier, if you are a parent of children and you want to do your best thing you can for those children, fix your own problems. Because it's so much easier if your problem. Think of it this way, right? Like, let's use a medical analogy. All right, we have some amazingly skilled doctors and that can do really amazing things with medicine. But let's imagine you have a gunshot wound. What's easier, to just prevent the gunshot wound in the first place, or to try to use our amazing medical science to save the person's life after they've been shot? You may succeed in the second one, but if there's a way to avoid it, hey, that's a whole lot easier to treat, right? Treatment, nothing, good to go. Same thing when it comes to children. If you do not fix yourself, you will wound them in the same way that you were wounded, that you are still wounded. And yes, there is treatment for that. It can be fixed, but it's a whole lot easier rather than putting out a bunch of stuff after the fact. Put the stuff on you beforehand, and it's better. Then you never develop the limp, never develop whatever the side effect is from the wound, just by avoiding it in the first place.
Yeah. You're reminding me of a line in a movie. But Dad, I spent thousands of dollars on therapy trying to get over what you said one day when I was 4 years old. Should I write you the check now?
Reminds me of a joke I heard.
But the point of it was a father and child having an honest conversation as adults about, this is what I had to overcome, and how do we prevent the overcoming by fixing ourselves first, right?
Absolutely. So I'll share a little piece of my own story. I did not have particularly awesome role models of father, and that's actually quite a bit of an understatement. And there were a lot of things that happened in that house growing up that they would qualify for the capital T trauma. And it was not until much later in my life, he went to jail for 10 years because of some of what happened in that house. And it's not until much later in my life that I realized how much I needed to forgive him. And so it was actually 2 years ago at my grandfather's funeral. It was the first time I'd been in the same room with him in quite some time. And I said, all right, Dad, we got to talk. And so I arranged a time. I chose a time after all the kids were in bed, left my wife in the hotel room with all the kids that were sleeping. It was an Airbnb, whatever. And met my dad at a spot where we could just talk. There was no one else there. It was actually my grandmother let us use one of the rooms in her house where we just chatted. And I had an honest conversation with him and we talked through it. And I went into that conversation for my own sake. And I say that selfishly because I knew that I had to get myself aligned and needed to say to him the words, you did this really hurt, and I forgive you. There was more than one this is. But that conversation changed me. By changing me, by allowing me to have more honesty with myself about what it is there, to live more in integrity with myself, to speak what I needed to speak. And I think my dad knew that. I don't know if he fully consciously knew that, but his response is not relevant to the moment. But to say that I went there because I knew what I needed to do to get that alignment, to get that presence ready, to be able to better love my own children and my wife. And it's tough. Like that took me years of various workings up, therapy, all this stuff combined to get to that moment where I could say those words to him. But I guarantee you it changed me.
Yeah. I guess that's the whole point. If you go through the uncomfortable on the other end, you're a better person for it.
That's the risk. As long as the right discomfort. Like don't go and stick your hand in a wood chipper. That's not going to be the right sort of discomfort.
Yeah. We'll leave put the wood chipper over there. We'll save it for the dead tree, not the live tree that we just think we should cut down just because we can.
It's so true.
That top or another. You said a lot of amazing things, and I realized that we're grinding down to our last few moments, and it's like, and you have 6 kids, and we don't need to know the age, but if you could build through yourself, you can build a world for them. What would that world look like?
I would dream of a world much better connected. Let me perhaps be specific. I think one thing the nearly universal response to the COVID situation showed and really highlighted was how alone we all are. While I greatly admire what the technology you and I both researched has brought about in our lives, one of the side effects is a tremendous amount of loneliness. And this loneliness is just debilitating. I think we're seeing this manifesting in a myriad of different ways. I think it's one of the major factors behind why marriages are struggling so much. And I think this separation from all the lockdowns, we know statistically what that did to divorce rates. They went through the roof. And we know what that does to children. The child abuse cases went through the roof. It's really horrific how much stuff happened. And there's this loneliness that is fundamentally contrary to the needs of the human soul that we are all suffering from horribly right now as a community, as a culture, as a society, as a planet. We have the most people ever on the planet, and they're the most disconnected from everyone else. And if I could change one piece of that world, I would like it that my children have someone they can go and talk to when they're feeling a certain way. Guys need a guy to talk to. Look, guys, if you're married, it is neither helpful nor beneficial to you in any way to just dump everything on your wife. That's the wrong way to use that relationship. It will not make things better. You need a guy to talk to. A guy who can stand there next to you. Like my favorite spots around a campfire, drinking a beer with my buddy after the kids are all in bed. This happened last night. We had a great conversation. And I say, look, Bob, here's what's going on in my life. I'm pissed off about this. I'm screwing this up. I feel complete failure here. I don't even know what to do with this one. You talk about it. He gives you perspective, and there's healing that can happen. But in order for that to even get to that level, you got to be close enough to Bob to go past, how's your sports team doing? Oh, there might be some snow in the weather. Whatever, like that kind of stuff is what the bulk of our conversations today are. And if I can make something for my kids, I want to build relationships and a culture that expects relationships that go so much deeper than that.
Wow. That's powerful stuff. All right. Best ways to get a hold of you and work with you.
Absolutely. So I'm Catholic. I work with anyone who's Christian. You got to at least be able to, have that component of the faith, because I believe God is real and that he does the real healing. So you can find me, CatholicLifeCoachForMen.com. My podcast is Catholic Life Coach for Men.
You even do your own podcast.
I do. I love it.
Yeah. Actually, I do. I have that one loaded up on my Apple Podcast myself. So
nice. Yeah, give me feedback. I'm always open to feedback and ideas. One of the things that I know what my download numbers are, but I'm always curious what people think after listening to episodes. So I'm same thing. Listening here as well. Like, I think as a podcast producer, we love the feedback we get, and it just every email I get that I save.
Yeah. I will. I share the story every now and again, and it's simply because it is valid. I was riding on a bus one time, and I didn't even know that I had a listener on that bus, and they quoted me. They quoted me to me. I was like, wow, that's amazing stuff. I said, I just, out of all gratitude, I said to him, hey, thanks. You know what? You listen to my podcast. You're like, that's you? It's like, yeah, thanks. It's like, that's wonderful. It means that I need to keep going.
Right.
So with that being said, to everyone listening out there, if you haven't already clicked on that subscribe button, click on it now. Become a subscriber, get more updates and more episodes like Michael. Just trying to help us become a better people and create a better world for ourselves. So, all right. Thanks, Michael.
Thank you, Michael. That was awesome.
This show has been produced by Depictions Media. Please contact us at depictions.media for more information.